All right, today we're jumping right into the Great Depression. We're going to cover what caused it, the absolute devastation it brought, and how the government first tried to handle things between 1929 and 1932.
So that's a great question, and we're going to answer it. We'll also dig into why President Herbert Hoover, a man who kicked off his term promising to wipe out poverty, ended up as one of the most disliked presidents in U.S. history. Okay, so we're going to break this down into 4 main parts. We'll look at how the whole crisis unfolded, from the chaos on Wall Street to what it was like for regular people just trying to get by. Let's dive in. So, the decade right before the crash, it was filled with this incredible optimism. But all that prosperity of the roaring 20s, it was really built on a house of cards. In the 1920s, you had this explosion of speculation. It was everywhere, from the land boom down in Florida all the way to the stock market. Tons of Americans got swept up in this belief that they could get rich, and get rich fast. And the most popular way to do this? It was called buying on margin. Basically, you could buy a bunch of stock with just a small down payment and borrow the rest. Now, this worked great as long as stock prices kept going up, but it made the entire market incredibly fragile. Well, that fragility really came to a head in late October 1929. The panic started on what we now call Black Thursday. It got worse on Monday, and then it all just came crashing down in a total collapse on Black Tuesday. On that one day, Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, people traded over 16 million shares, just desperately trying to sell. And in a matter of hours, $14 billion in wealth, poof, just gone. So you can see how this culture of risky investing, and especially buying on margin, was a direct cause of the crash. But let's go back to that key fact. Only about 10% of American households even own stock. So how on earth did the crash hurt everybody else? Well, here's your answer, and it's a big one. Over 90% of the banks had invested their customers' money, their life savings, in the stock market. Suddenly, pretty much everyone was tied to Wall Street's fate, whether they knew it or not. You see, the crash itself was really just the trigger. The economy was already in a pretty weak spot because of 3 big underlying problems: a shaky international debt situation, a massive gap between the rich and poor, which limited who could buy things, and just the psychology of panic. Once that started, it spread like wildfire. So remember, the crash didn't create the Great Depression all by itself. It just blew the lid off the problems that were already simmering underneath. Okay, so with that, let's turn to President Hoover's response to this growing mess. So as the country is just spiraling downward, President Hoover's reaction is guided by this very rigid personal philosophy, and it turned out to be completely disastrously wrong for that moment in history. See, Hoover was a huge believer in something he called American individualism. He was convinced that success comes from individual hard work and self-reliance, not from government handouts. He really thought that kind of aid would destroy the country's character. And this right here just shows the huge disconnect. His whole philosophy of self-reliance and small government it had no answer for a total national collapse where millions were out of work for reasons that had nothing to do with them. Yeah, because he was so afraid it would make people dependent, Hoover flat out refused to give direct federal aid to people. Instead, he set up something called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to loan money to banks, hoping it would somehow trickle down to everyone else. Spoiler alert, it didn't. It didn't take long for the public's anger to just boil over. Hoover's own name became a kind of shorthand for poverty, getting attached to all these grim symbols of the Depression. The absolute breaking point, though, came in the spring of 1932. A group of about 15,000 World War I veterans, known as the Bonus Army, marched on Washington, D.C. They were there to demand an early payment of a bonus they'd been promised for serving their country. Hoover said no, and then he ordered the U.S. Army to forcibly remove them from their makeshift camps. The images of soldiers using tear gas on veterans and burning their shanties, it horrified the country and just completely destroyed what was left of his public image. So remember, Hoover stuck to his principles, but it meant his response was just too little, too late. Now let's really look at the devastating human cost of all this. For millions and millions of ordinary Americans, the Depression wasn't some abstract thing about stock prices. It was a brutal, daily grind just to stay alive. By 1932, the numbers were just staggering. A full quarter of the American workforce had no job. And the crisis was especially cruel to minority communities. For African Americans, unemployment hit a catastrophic 50%. This era also saw a horrifying rise in racial violence. A perfect example is the infamous Scottsboro Boys case. In 1931, 9 black teenagers in Alabama were falsely accused and convicted, shining a harsh light on a justice system riddled with racism. And for farmers, things were even worse. On top of the economic crisis, they faced a massive environmental one, the Dust Bowl. And you have to understand, this wasn't just a string of bad weather. It was a man-made disaster. See, for decades, improper farming techniques had stripped the topsoil from the Great Plains. So when a really bad drought hit, all that soil just blew away in these enormous dust storms. They called them black blizzards that just wiped out farms. What was the nickname for the farmers who fled? Remember, they were called Okies. You can really feel the heartbreak in the words of this Oklahoma farmer, Caroline Henderson. She just couldn't believe that all her hard work could be so perishable, just blown away. So remember, the Depression brought on this immense suffering, but it wasn't shared equally. Now, with all that in mind, how is President Hoover remembered? Let's take a look at his troubled legacy. Okay, so let's be clear. Herbert Hoover didn't cause the stock market to crash, but his entire presidency is, and probably always will be, judged by how he handled the crisis that came next. If you look beyond the Depression, his foreign policy record is kind of mixed. He actually had some successes, like improving relations with Latin America. But he also made some huge mistakes, and none was bigger than the Smoot-Hawley tariff. This tariff, passed in 1930, was supposed to protect American businesses by jacking up taxes on imports. But it backfired, big time. It set off a global trade war that just slammed the door on international markets and made the worldwide depression so much worse. So in the end, you have a president whose deeply held beliefs about individualism and limited government left him completely unable to rise to the challenge his country was facing. So remember, while he had some foreign policy wins, Hoover's legacy is ultimately defined by his inadequate response to the Depression. It's really a cautionary tale about how an ideology can fail in the face of a national catastrophe. All right, for your final review, let's lock in the most important facts from this explainer. Okay, here are the absolute must-know takeaways. Risky speculation with borrowed money led directly to the crash. The day it all started was Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929. Hoover's belief in American individualism kept him from providing direct relief. The brutal removal of the bonus army, that was a political disaster for him. The Dust Bowl wasn't just a drought, it was a man-made environmental crisis. By 1932, unemployment was near 25% and a staggering 50% for African Americans. And finally, the Smoot-Hawley tariff totally crippled global trade, making a bad situation even worse. So if American individualism failed so completely, what philosophy was going to come next to pull the nation out of its deepest crisis? Well, that question sets the stage perfectly for the dramatic shift in government that was about to happen. Thanks for joining us on The Explainer.